should see its grounding in that moment, not in this moment of it's rational for me to care about a suffering animal, or it's rational for me to adopt this particular ethical theory. I think animal liberation should see itself as a moment of responsivity to otherness and a moment of responsivity to animal suffering, whatever it might be. But it's not just a responsivity to animal suffering, or it's a response to otherness in general. So the modern European tradition would ask for an enlarged scope of responsibility, an enlarged scope of otherness. Starting from that point, animal liberation would be one strategy and one response. Environmental ethics would be another, feminism would be another, and you could link all of these movements under an enlarged notion of responsibility. The European tradition offers the tools for this. For those of you who are familiar with feminist theory, you might know, say, Judith Butler's work or Wendy Brown's work, or people like that. This is the tradition and the kind of thinking they're using. I think animal liberation should take a similar kind of tack. So, without going into that in too much detail, because it gets a little bit arcane and boring, let me just hop over here to this section on why I think animal liberationists should go into this. So, why should animal liberationists adopt this notion of the self? Thank you. I got 10 minutes. I'll be done in 10. On the one hand, an understanding of subjectivity that's based in a radical passivity or an openness to the other opens the door to a broader conception of subjectivity that is not limited to human beings. In other words, we aren't going to start with a human model and then push it out to animals. Rather, we're going to have a larger model of subjectivity that doesn't give any special place to human beings. What this would do is it would undercut the typical binary between humans and animals. Animals, by contrast, have typically been seen as purely instinctual or mechanical beings with no capacity for self-determination, creativity, or responsivity. The kind of theory I'm talking about here, what's called post-humanist theory, the modern European tradition, undercuts the classical binary opposition between humans and animals, in as much as it focuses on the common ground of all forms of subjectivity. In other words, it's not about trying to figure out what humans are about and then see if animals can fit into this picture. It's trying to come up with a generalized notion of what it is to be a self that can be found throughout the natural world. It isn't limited to humans. Now, much of animal liberationist discourse and practice has taken a different route from the modern European tradition. By and large, animal liberationists tend to demonstrate and use classical notions of subjectivity and moral patiency. In other words, this classical notion of the self. Now, what they try to argue is that this classical notion of the self that you find in Descartes and other philosophers can't be limited to animals. We can find it elsewhere. So Tom Reagan spends a hell of a lot of time making an argument that we can find this in all kinds of animals. Peter Singer, we can find sentience in all kinds of animals. Stephen Wise, you can find legal personhood in all kinds of animals. But you can't find them in all animals. You only find them in certain kinds of animals. And typically, as most of you know, which kind of animals these guys talk about, very highly sophisticated, so-called higher order animals, right, with high, basically sophisticated cognitive capacities. These guys use Darwinian premises and continuous logic, and they argue that argue that we should, as a matter of strict justice and logic, wherever we can find human traits in the animal kingdom, extend moral and legal consideration to these animals. But anyone who's been involved in animal rights activism for more than a few minutes recognizes the mixed blessing that such a strategy represents. The strategy of trying to assimilate animals to human ethics, which is basically the gesture that's being made here by the dominant tradition, where and when successful, is extremely useful in as much as it can provide immediate protection for animals, and it can lead to important institutional reforms. In other words, Singer, Reagan, they've made big moves. The thought has been used in useful ways. It's led to all kinds of legislation and basically all kinds of movements. Wouldn't want to knock it for that. So various laws, such as the Animal Welfare Act, are good examples of the success of this approach. And even in those instances where such laws have been applied inconsistently or in a limited manner, the formal and perfectible structure of the law promises that incremental reforms could lead to more just and humane relations with other animals, right? So if these laws were carried out, perhaps it could lead to better reforms and more advances. But the obvious downside to this approach, the one that most of you would know about, is that many animals simply do not measure up to classical models of subjectivity. You can't demonstrate with clarity that they're self-aware or higher order cognitive capacities that these guys want to have. It comes as no surprise that the most compelling legal and moral arguments on behalf of animal rights are directed toward animals that most closely resemble human beings, especially animals considered higher order primates and cognitively sophisticated domestic animals. Take two examples. Tom Reagan's groundbreaking case for animal rights. He employs an exhaustive list of criteria to determine who or what can be called a moral agent or a moral patient, in other words, a moral subject. Reagan admits that his case for animal rights is not really about animals at all, if you read the book carefully. It's rather about mammals 1 year of age and older. That's all his theory can cover, strictly speaking, and he admits as much. No bones about it. The logic of moral rights theory, the tradition that he's grounded in, uses a classical notion of subjectivity, and it will only extend to include animals who fulfill this rigorous criteria of what it is to be a moral subject or a moral patient. Using Reagan's moral theory, it would be extremely difficult to argue against abuse committed against any non-mammal or those mammals less than 1 year old. And that's by and large most of the animals that we're trying to protect. Or, take another example. Stephen Wise's well-known book nowadays is Making Big Moves, both his books, Rattling the Cage and Drawing the Line. In both of these books, he makes exhaustive cases for legal rights for animals, or rather, for those animals who satisfy the minimal conditions of subjectivity and legal personhood. Wise's second book is particularly revealing of the limitations of his approach. In this book, he is able to make a case for legal rights only for a very select group of animals. Which ones? You expect. Apes, dolphins, high-order sophisticated animals. Now, I don't mean to belittle their efforts. I respect their work a great deal. Their work's indispensable, and I don't want to abandon it either. That's not the point. But it is clear to anyone who works on activist issues that this approach has serious limits, and that we are desperately in need of a more inclusive theory and practice of animal liberation. And the resources for such an expansion do not appear to be forthcoming from the dominant approach, largely because it is rooted in and committed to this philosophy of the subject, or this idea that the self is at the ground of contemporary ethics. Now, we've got 5 minutes. I've got only 2 pages left. I'm there. Now, you could say that, hey, Reagan, Wise, these guys don't have a choice. This is the logic of the discourse they work in. Philosophy demands that you start from a subject. Legal theory demands that you start from a subject. They're just arguing from precedent or arguing from, internal logical constraints. Very, very true. But yet, as Marty Keel's pointed out and other theorists have pointed out, these appear to be strategies at first. In other words, how can we get into moral theory and inject animals into it? How can we get into legal theory and inject animals into it? Well, we'll use these strategies here. These strategies have now become sedimented. They block our thinking, they lock it into certain channels, and they don't allow us to open onto the other struggles. So this is one of the things I want to address very briefly here. In short, the strategies and theories of animal liberation that were originally just forms of legal and moral extensionism, basic strategies, they had an initial pragmatic and an initial intuitive appeal. We shared some of these ideas and we stretched them, and they worked. But these have slowly become reified, sedimented, fixed in place at an ontological or a philosophical level. In short, many theorists and activists now seem to believe in these approaches and cannot see beyond them. Tools designed initially for militants have now become shackles for those activists and theorists who are seeking more effective and creative strategies. Once locked into place, these frameworks and belief systems serve to create artificial barriers between animal liberation and more expansive and radical political movements such as environmentalism, just to name one. This is the situation we find ourselves in today, where animal rights and liberation are seen basically as special interest politics with little or no relation to radical environmentalism or to other movements in the progressive and radical left. My suggestion here is that this limitation is the primary challenge that needs to be addressed and overcome by contemporary animal liberationists, especially in above-ground mainstream circles. Underground activists, especially more militant groups, have already learned this lesson. So this is one of the things that Marty and I were talking about beforehand. I don't believe this is a problem at an underground level. I think it's a problem at an above-ground level. Underground activists seem to be able to build coalitions and links without these kinds of ideological barriers. So one need only witness all the joint actions undertaken by, say, the ELF and ALF, just to pick 2. You wouldn't see PETA and Sierra Club getting together on a whole lot of issues, but you'll see ELF activists and ALF activists and cells getting together on all kinds of issues. Now, this is why I would warn against relying exclusively on the kinds of arguments offered on behalf of the ALF by my esteemed colleagues Stephen Best and Richard Kahn, who I work with on the journal. These guys, following the kind of standard reformist approach of critical theorists, what they try to do is take radical militant activism and inscribe it within the progressive liberal tradition and compare such actions of liberating animals to democratic and humanist freedom fighters. Now, if those kind of arguments, in other words, trying to say that the ALF is just the new kind of freedom fighter, new kind of revolutionaries, and that rationale is used to liberate captured ALF activists, bingo, I'm all for it. Great strategy. But I don't want to limit the ALF or any kind of militant activism or these kinds of models to just that explanation. I would want to insist that we not limit our understanding of militant activism to this framework. To my mind, militant activists such as the ALF should be seen as a constant reminder to all of us who work in defense of animals that our existing political frameworks and traditions are almost completely unresponsive to animals and other non-human beings, and that a radical cultural and political revolution is necessary should we wish to develop a politics that meets our goals. In other words, it's not a matter of saying the ALF belongs to a well-established tradition. No, it's blowing that tradition up and should be acknowledged as such. That the only hope for animal liberation or for dealing with the kinds of things we want to deal with is to largely, I believe, abandon this tradition and start fresh. Not all of it, but by and large, most of it. So from this perspective, recent debates between animal rights and new welfareism, this kind of binary that's going on nowadays, perpetuated by Gary Francione